All right. Welcome all to this event run by the Indigenous Studies Discussion Group, or the ISDG, at the University of Cambridge. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to host our third event as a research network at the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, also known as CRASSH. We are grateful to CRASSH and the Cambridge Heritage Research Center for their support of this group. The ISDG is a graduate-led initiative started in 2019 with the objectives of 1, promoting scholarship by and about Indigenous peoples across disciplines and spaces to be a regular feature of the intellectual life of Cambridge, and 2, promoting the sharing and discussion of insights and ideas pertaining to Indigenous studies across peoples, disciplines, times, and geographies. Today's event is titled Policing and Victimization of Gypsy, Traveller, and Roma Communities in the UK and Europe. And we're very happy to have Professor Zoe James in conversation with Professor Nicola Padfield for this event. Professor James completed her PhD at the University of Surrey on the policing of new travellers and has been at the University of Plymouth since 1999. Professor James's work focuses specifically on research with Gypsy, Traveller, and Roma communities. Exploring experiences of policing and victimization, Professor James's professional interests center around criminology, hate studies, and race. She is the co-director of the International Network for Hate Studies. Professor Nicola Padfield is Professor of Criminology and Penal Justice, Director of the Cambridge Center for Criminal Justice, and has a career which has spanned many areas of criminal law, substantive, procedural, evidentiary, and also engages with prisons and post-sentence enforcement. Professor Padfield has been active in a number of pan-European research networks and the Criminal Law Review, and has been working on issues around supporting the rehabilitation and resettlement of persons involved in criminal offenses. Just before I hand over the stage to Professor James and Professor Padfield, I had a few housekeeping tips. So one is for everyone who's not the panelists, please keep your microphones turned off. The event is being recorded, so please keep in mind that you can choose to keep your cameras on and or off as you prefer. By remaining in the room as we record the meeting, your consent is assumed. The recording will be available on the CRASSH website and on the ISDG Cambridge YouTube channel soon after the event. During the Q&A session, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the chat function to send a message and I'll read it out to the panelists, or you could choose to unmute yourself and ask the question in person. You can indicate that in the chat. Captioning will be turned on for this event. If you'd like to have captioning, you can select it at the bottom of your screen. I'll turn that on in just a second. Please note that captions are provided by Zoom and CRASSH can't be held responsible for its accuracy. And rest assured that you'll be able to revisit the recording on YouTube after the event is over. We're trying to do our best to provide an inclusive environment in this online event. And it goes without saying that all attendees are expected to show respect and courtesy to the speakers and each other through the event. And with this, the housekeeping tips are over, and I then hand it over to you, Professor James. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishant, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you all today. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be here virtually. And I think, you know, this environment is great in many ways. While it would have been lovely to come to Cambridge, it's really good to be able to actually catch up with people and you know, and talk about this work with people who are distant. So I think there are loads of advantages to this, but I appreciate that it is can be challenging in terms of asking questions or communicating. But yeah, I look forward to people asking questions if you want to later on. So my role today is to talk a little bit about Gypsies, Travellers and Roma and their experiences of victimisation and policing. And then Nikki and I are going to have a chat about that. And as I say, you're welcome to ask questions as well. So the first thing we need to start off doing is identifying who the Gypsies, Travellers and Roma are that I'm going to be talking about today. It's really important that I start off by noting that I am not from a Gypsy, Traveller or Roma background. I don't have Gypsy, Traveller or Roma heritage, and I am purely here by virtue of the fact that I have had the pleasure of working with Gypsies, Travellers and Roma for many years. So I've been working in this field for about 25 years, and I've been hopefully providing space for the voices of Gypsies, Travellers and Roma. So I think that's really important to note in the first instance. And I think it's important to note the fact that there's a methodological issue around that, in that in my role as an outsider, you know, I take I'm very cautious about making any assumptions about the communities that I'm working with. And so I do engage with communities all of the time, and I really welcome feedback. I hope that I'm not what Juan Tauri referred to a couple of weeks ago in this seminar as a FIFO academic, as in flying in and flying out. I've dedicated my career to raising the voices of Gypsies, Travellers and Roma, but I think there are some real risks around that, and there are risks of putting myself in the spaces of Gypsies, Travellers and Roma and getting in the way, which I hope not to do. There are risks of broken promises. So when we're doing research, we're talking with people and we're sharing people's voices. And with that, there's kind of a desire as an academic to make change happen, to see debate shift and reorient itself. And that's a real uphill struggle. And so I'm very much aware of the fact that I can't make promises that what I'm doing will make a difference, but I try. And I feel a really important and integral part of my work is about ensuring there is an impact to that work. And that's a very trendy sort of word to use within current academic environments. We will need to do impactful work, but I see that as always having been implicit in my work. And I think there's a real worry. So in the session a couple of weeks ago, Juan Tauri and Alison Whitaker talked about the fact that sometimes people from excluded communities can kind of be wheeled in because they are the people who are supposed to be, you know, voiced. And I'm really cautious of that as well. I don't want to set people up to fail. I don't want to put people in uncomfortable positions. So where I am at is that I've done a lot of work in this area. And I've worked with a lot of communities, but I'm hoping that through that work, I'm creating a space within the Academy for Gypsies, Travellers and Roma themselves to come forward and to take over from me as a white middle-class academic. And that's my kind of goal. And I'm doing a lot of work with people within my university, but also within a network of other universities about bringing Gypsies, Travellers and Roma into higher education more. And I think that's really, really important. And that's some work that's being really initiated by Margaret Greenfield at Bucks New University, or she was there, but it's still hosted by Bucks New University. So I think that's important to note in the first instance. So Gypsies, Travellers and Roma that I've worked with are generally, I've worked in the UK. So I've worked with Romany Gypsies, Irish Travellers, Scottish Travellers, Welsh Gael, new Travellers, show people, and also Roma who have come to the UK from Central and Eastern Europe, but from across Europe. mainland Europe, I should say. And increasingly, we're acknowledging that we need to also be talking about people who are boaters, so people who live on our waterways, as well as people who may be sedentary, living in housing, but also people who live nomadically. So I've generally worked within that space and within amongst Gypsies, Travellers and Roma in the UK, but I've also worked in Europe and have done some work with the OSCE around Roma inclusion. And specifically, I did some work in Romania, but I'm also doing other research projects that are pan-European. So despite the tragedy that is Brexit, we are still managing to do a lot of that work, which is great. So to turn to the sort of topic at hand and where I've really focused my work over the years, and that is and has been around the policing of Gypsies, Travellers and Roma, but increasingly the victimisation of Gypsies, Travellers and Roma. Now, in my research, it became very apparent pretty early on, really, that when we talk to Gypsies and Travellers about their experiences of victimisation or their experiences of policing, those experiences are conflated. They are on a continuum. They're very much part of the same thing. And so as I've grown as an academic and as I've explored different theoretical perspectives to help me understand why Gypsies and Travellers are treated ill, I have turned increasingly towards a more semiological approach in my research. What that means is that as a criminologist, I engage increasingly with a harm-oriented perception. So I'm interested in how harms manifest for Gypsies, Travellers and Roma. And I specifically in my work have used Zizek's concept of or concepts of violence. So I utilise his notions of subjective, systemic and symbolic violence as is used by ultra-realist criminologists. And I found that really useful to allow me to unpack the harmful experiences that Gypsies, Travellers and Roma have throughout their lived experiences. I've done lots of research that has incorporated needs assessments of Gypsies and Travellers accommodation needs right the way through that have incorporated their lack of access to accommodation, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. I've done work around policing and how policing happens, both through the public police, but also multi-agencies, so private policing mechanisms, technological policing, and also wider policing more broadly. I've also done qualitative and quantitative work as well as ethnographic research. So I've got quite a rounded perception of how we can understand the social spaces that we are in. And as a criminologist, I draw on multiple disciplinary backdrops. So criminology, we tend to talk about as a meeting point discipline. Criminology is, you know, meeting point sounds really nice, but we probably just go and nick things from all over the place. We are interested in psychology, sociology, history, geography. We're looking across the spectrum of the social sciences, really, to try and understand what's going on in the world. My backdrop was that I did an undergraduate sociology degree. So, you know, I have got that sort of sociological underpinning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and unpack and talk a little bit about Gypsies, Travellers and Roma's experience of harm through that semiological lens of violence. And so first of all, I tend to talk about the violence that Gypsies, Travellers and Roma experience that is subjective. So that tends to take up the majority of hate studies research interest around how hate happens and what happens in relation to hate. So we tend to talk about hate crimes and hate incidents. And across Europe and internationally, and in the UK, we talk about hate crimes, and hate crimes are crimes that have been committed against a person on the basis of a biased motivation. So hate crime legislation allows for sentence enhancement on the basis of a crime being committed on a biased motivation. And it's really, really easy. It's not easy, it's really hard, but it's the sort of most obvious form of hate that we can really understand, the most obvious harm that we can see. We can see very clearly when someone experiences violence against the person, if somebody is physically assaulted, or if somebody experiences hate speech, if somebody's spoken ill of or spoken ill onto online or in person, we can really clearly see what's happening there. And we can see very clearly through research that Gypsies, Travellers and Roma have experienced multiple violence against them in multiple subjective manners. So my research has evidenced, you know, all sorts of horrendous crimes, from physical assaults right the way through to just petty ill treatment. And so, you know, that's really important to acknowledge. And in hate studies, we tend to acknowledge that quite confidently. We know this is happening and we can measure it. And we're seeing, you know, reporting of hate increasing, which is great, so that we can tackle it more directly, and we can see policing agencies engaging with those reports, etc. And we can set up corrective mechanisms around that and education, etc. But what we tend to talk about less are other forms of violence. And those are the ones that I'm kind of trying to unpack a little bit more. We do more often, though not as much, talk about systemic violence. And systemic violence are the ways in which systems engage with communities. So policing, local authorities, welfare services, legislation, etc. How those systems are in and of themselves problematic for the people, for Gypsies, Travellers and Roma. And we can really see multiple layers of systemic violence. So, for example, we see lots of examples of direct discrimination towards Gypsies, Travellers and Roma. They're treated very differently. They experience racism very directly on an everyday basis. We see people in the UK, for example. My research has shown that Gypsies and Travellers, that research did not include Roma, but as in European Roma, Gypsies and Travellers being heavily over-policed. So being stopped, searched, being accused of crimes, being conceived of as criminal. We see that happening all of the time. So there's a real issue around policing of Gypsies, Travellers and Roma. And that goes across Europe. So I've done a bit of work with policing agencies in Europe around how they tackle racism towards Roma within police services. But it's not just within policing, it goes through the multiple agencies who are often engaging with Gypsies, Travellers and Roma in terms of welfare. So we see welfare agencies discriminating against Gypsies, Travellers and Roma. We see removal of children. We see multiple oversight, extensive oversight of Gypsies, Travellers and Roma, often because those communities live in spaces of poverty. And so they have become increasingly securitized. Van Bar refers to the communities as securitized communities, losing my words. So we see this classic overlapping of welfare and essentially punishment within the governance of Gypsies, Travellers and Roma. And Gypsies, Travellers and Roma are perceived as risky populations, as populations who are at risk to those people who are not Gypsies, travellers and Roma. They are seen as risky to themselves, and they're also seen as risky to the spaces in which they inhabit. So that discrimination that we often consider in light of sort of very standard agencies of criminal justice actually trickles down into the multiple agencies who are essentially problematizing Gypsies, travellers and Roma, and attempting to manage them and thus control them. And akin to other minoritized communities, Gypsies and travellers and Roma are excluded and harmed through their negation as well. So they're not included within positive approaches to social endeavour and social engagement. They're ignored, and their needs are particularly ignored. And in the UK, we have a really significant problem around ignoring the needs of Gypsies, travellers and Roma. And this is where I go back to one of the ways in which my research has kind of fed into this broader concept of harm. So in 2006, I did a review of the needs of the accommodation needs of Gypsies and travellers and in my local area, and set out for the local authority the accommodation needs of Gypsies, travellers over the coming years, and barely any of those needs have been met, 15 years later. So going out to Gypsies and travellers and saying, can you engage with my research and we'll try and get you some accommodation and we'll sort out some accommodation that's appropriate for you, that you want, that works for you. And this is particularly for nomadic Gypsies and travellers, obviously. And it's failed. It hasn't worked. They've been negated. They haven't been included. They haven't been considered, despite the fact that legislation required their needs to be assessed and considered, etc. So that's just one example of the negation of the needs of Gypsies, travellers and Roma. So, and that's actually true across Europe. So accommodation is a massive issue for Gypsies and travellers and Roma throughout Europe. So in the UK, it's particularly focused around the provision of space for nomadic, so mobile Gypsies travellers. But in Europe, it's actually been about the ghettoisation of Roma, placing Roma in specific spaces, housing and accommodation that doesn't suit their needs, that separates those communities out, again, as a risky community. God, I'm realising how much I can go on because I've got loads of pieces of paper left. Okay, so I'm really whipping through here. It's really hard to cover everything. But we need to acknowledge the subjective harms that Gypsies, travellers and Roma experience, the systemic harms that they experience. But I would argue that we also need to acknowledge the symbolic violence that underpins the systemic and subjective violence that Gypsies, travellers and Roma experience. And that symbolic violence is how the language and symbols of social life function to negate the needs of those communities and to prevent them from flourishing. And as I said, so Gypsies, travellers and Roma are often placed in such difficult circumstances through their multiple negations, through social policy, etc., that they live within the poorest parts of our society and what Standing has referred to as the precariat, the most precarious spaces of our social life. And within the precariat, they are part of, amongst multiple communities who are fighting over very minimal resources. So those fights over those minimal resources mean that Gypsies, travellers and Roma can really hold their heads up high to flourish. They're busy trying to gain access to fair and equal space. And rather than necessarily seeing that wider societal space as problematic that's placing them in the precariat, Gypsies, travellers and Roma are seeing other people within the precariat as the problem, and those other people are seeing them as the problem. So there's infighting within that space, and even amongst Gypsies, travellers and Roma themselves. And that's something I want to come to a little bit in a moment. So that the violence of creating this social world where we have such significant relative deprivation, and where we have racialized Gypsies, travellers and Roma as a community of difference. So we have seen multiple different tensions occur. So one of the pieces of work that I've been doing more recently has been around the conflation of Gypsy, traveller and Roma identity. And that conflation of identity, to me, is hugely problematic, and to other academics working in this field. So across Europe, Europe has multiple different Gypsy traveller but Roma communities. So I'm really trying to be careful with my language, because when I say Roma, that's a kind of catch-all term for multiple different peoples, different communities with different cultures, different nationalities, different ways of living. Their common experience, tragically, tends to be around their exclusion and their deprivation. The creation of the notion of Roma as one group of people that can come together in solidarity was perceived as a very positive bringing together of peoples. But there has been quite a strong critique of that within European discussion around the fact that actually by creating this sort of notion of Roma as one group, it separates out those people from their national identities, and they become a domestic problem or a domestic threat to some degree. So you see this exclusion happening, and then as academics such as Koze, Yildiz and De Genova have argued, what you see is you see the European bureaucracy being the space within which the problem of Roma is supposed to be addressed. And it kind of creates this sort of vicious circle of solidifying the vulnerability of Roma and separating Roma from any sort of state-centric responsibility. And UK policy and practice has really engaged with that as well. So Europe, in the UK, as part of Europe, we have totally taken on board this notion of Roma, Gypsies and travellers as vulnerable, as experiencing racism and being a population that needs some sort of management. And that in itself has served to negate the diversity, the heterogeneity of Roma communities across Europe and within the UK. And in research, what you're seeing happening is that there's a conflation of identity as well. So you're seeing Gypsies, travellers and Roma being pulled together as one community, as if they all have the same needs, wants, desires, etc. And they're very different. And particularly as migrants to the UK, many European Roma suffer very different circumstances to those Indigenous Gypsies, Romany Gypsies, for example, or Irish travellers who have been here since the 12th century. You know, their issues are very different to those of European Roma, somebody who's come over from whichever part of mainland Europe. By bringing them together in reports and ways of talking about Gypsies and travellers, what we're seeing is a sort of augmentation of the notion of them as a vulnerable community. And that's really, really problematic. And it's racialized. It's placing Gypsies, Roma and travellers within a racialized space rather than acknowledging the heterogeneity. And in the UK particularly, there are Gypsies travellers who are not acknowledged as racial groups. So new travellers, show people, boaters, none of them are included within equalities legislation. Whereas in terms of planning legislation, they fulfill the definition of who is a Gypsy traveller. So you have these competing symbols of who is legitimate and who is not legitimate in different spaces, in different contexts. And that augments the competition between those communities. It creates a hierarchy of legitimacy, and that hierarchy of legitimacy is often based on racial identity, which, you know, really essentializes those communities in negative ways. It's quite interesting when you look at UK literature and you look at reporting that's going on in the UK, and often show people are separated out. So the people that go around doing fairs, etc., around the country, they're often separated out and not included in reports because legislation around who constitutes show people is different. And it's quite interesting because often show people are the most successful, most wealthy of Gypsy and traveller communities in the UK. They often do very well. So it serves a really nice purpose to exclude them from reports that are saying these communities are vulnerable. And it enhances that notion that Gypsies and travellers can't be successful, can't manage themselves, don't have legitimate needs. So there are multiple, you know, little things going on here that I think we need to unpack and we need to talk about and we need to think about. Essentially, funding of initiatives to support Gypsies and travellers and Roma are also very much based on this hierarchy of legitimacy, like who can get funding for what is about competing over very limited resources. And again, you get these narratives around very, very narrow conceptions of race and racialized ideas of Gypsies, travellers and Roma that don't actually talk to the lived experience of those communities. And I would argue that this is really, really harmful for these communities. I think that you know, layers of harm that we're talking about and how harm manifests is not simply resolved through apparent inclusion and inclusion strategies. Because inclusion strategies are often written without any understanding of nuance about who people are and what their experiences are. When I talk to Gypsies, travellers and Roma, they have very different needs in different contexts, etc. So I'm trying to wrap up so that I can have a conversation with Nikki. So essentially, I think it's important for us to think about these different layers of exclusion, these different types of violence that Gypsies, travellers and Roma experience. I think these are augmented within neoliberal capitalist space, where we value what people have rather than who they are. And resources are so finite that they are a battle to attain in order to have any sort of progression. I think we need to move away from perceiving legitimacy in terms of race. I think we need to not devolve race to such a narrow conception that serves to augment racialization. And I think we need to do these things because what I see happening is I see Gypsies, travellers and Roma hiding, not presenting themselves because they're in fear of the multiple systems that are against them, essentially. I see internalized issues within Gypsy and traveller communities occurring, wherein people are scared to engage with wider society. And therefore we see, for example, we don't see initiatives tackling domestic abuse being taken up. within some Gypsy and Traveller communities because of fear of engaging with the outside world. If you go back to the fact that welfare has been used as punishment, why would you then go to welfare agencies to get support? And we see individuals suffering cognitive dissonance, essentially, their sense of identity really clashing with who they are and who they're meant to be, really, you know, not working internally for individuals, and thus we see really high levels of depression, and we're seeing really high levels of suicide, for example, amongst Gypsy and Traveller communities in the UK and across Europe amongst Roma communities. So we have multiple problems around communities being disrupted and broken, and individuals suffering their own harms as well. So that's a massive potted like thing in about half an hour or so of of some of the harms of hate and some of the harms of systemic prejudice against Gypsies, Travellers and Roma.
Thanks, Zoe. Can I just take over from that? Wonderful. I will talk for about 5 minutes just to give you a chance to sip a glass of water or whatever you might have. But I really want to hear more from you in a minute. I think where I want to say is a huge thank you. Everybody knows, I think, that we have to tackle racial and ethnic disparities in criminal justice. But just to acknowledge that doesn't get us very far. So we can all pay huge welcome to the efforts of people like David Lammy with the Lammy Review, focusing on Black young men's experience of criminal justice. But this topic of Gypsy, Romani and Traveller minorities within criminal justice hasn't got to the top of the agenda in the same way. And maybe that's first of many questions for you. Why hasn't it reached the top of the agenda? Why does tackling racial disparity often not include the people that you're talking about? So perhaps I should actually just start by really thanking you for your work over very many years, for your presentation tonight. Thank you to the ISDG network too, who are allowing us to have this conversation, which is such an important conversation. So perhaps 3 points that I'll start with. Of course, it was good that you started by identifying who we're talking about and the responsibility of the researcher flying in and flying out. We all have that problem. Those of us who do qualitative research in particular, sharing other people's voices. Are we stealing their voices? No, of course we're not. I like the way you put it, that you're trying to make yourself redundant. In my own work, I've only come across a certain number of Gypsy and Traveller people, and they stick in my memory just very, very clearly. One man, when I was doing a parole study, and not everybody here will understand how parole works, but you get an enormous dossier, sometimes 100 pages long, just thrust at you in your cell. And this man just looked at me with his huge, hundreds of pages dossier and said, I can't read. I didn't have the grace of education. And what a system it is that gives people hundreds of pages in a dossier when it knows they can't read. Just a small example. The next big question that I have for you flows around the problems of counting people by race and ethnicity. Should we? I thought it was really interesting what you said about the conflation of identity, and that by putting people into these boxes, we are somehow racializing them and pretending that things are straightforward, which just aren't straightforward. I work quite a lot in France. My French colleagues tend to say it's outrageous how we're counting all the time in this country, how many people of this ethnicity are in prison or stop and search by the police or whatever. And I stick with the position which I grew up with, which in a sense is we need to count in order to know the answer. So looking at one of my favorite sources of statistics, which is most certainly, I'd say, not the government statistics. I don't think any of the official statistics on criminal justice, the Section 91 statistics on race and crime, don't, I think, talk about Gypsy, Romany or traveller people at all. So I go to the fact files, the Bromley fact files on the Prison Reform Trust's website, which are wonderful. And they tell me that 5% of men and 7% of women in prison say they are of Gypsy, Roma or traveller background, compared to an estimated 0.1% of the general population in England. Now that is a terrifying statistic. 5% of men, 7% of women in prison are Gypsy, Roma, traveller, and yet they are only 0.1% of the general population. It is guaranteed to be a hugely unreliable statistic. It is subject to all those problems that you suggest of people being squeezed into boxes that they don't fit into. But my instinct, and I'm not an expert here, is that it's important to count, to be aware of this sort of overrepresentation. It's also shocking, I think, that most prison inspectors are not aware of the high number of Gypsy traveller people in their prisons, and their special needs, and I'll come back to needs in a minute, aren't adequately identified when they're looking to find culturally appropriate support for when they're released or whatever. The figures for young people, incidentally, and children in custody is even worse. But my main question I think I want to throw at you at this point, and I could have millions more if we've got a lot of time, is what are the implications of your research for both sentencing, which is one of my main areas of interest, but also penal policy generally? Of course, in sentencing, I think it is very clear that we need to individualize sentences, be aware of the context of people's offending, of the huge amount of violence in their background. Does that take you as far as it took Julian Roberts, who gave a seminar last week? One or two members of our group here may have been at Julian Roberts's Thursday evening seminar last Thursday at the Institute of Criminology, where he put the case for standard mitigation at sentencing based on racial and social adversity, that sentencers should recognize that the state has dirty hands in a sense, and that race isn't some neutral factor and should be recognized in mitigation. Deeply controversial and very, very interesting. The bigger penal system, sentencing system, I think aims at reducing reoffending. And it's quite clear that if you want to reduce reoffending, you don't do it in the way that we do it at the moment. You talked about the negation of people's needs in needs assessments. And I think that is fantastically important. It's important for the precariat generally, which you mentioned. Again, from my personal experience, I sit on a wonderful group called the Women's Homeless Action Group in Cambridge. And we are often told by the powers that be that women don't engage with services, homeless women don't engage with services. Well, the reason they don't engage with services is because the services are completely the wrong services on offer. And again, I think your work is really, really important there. I think I'll stop at that point. There are lots of other things that I could raise, but I want you to say something about, should we be counting? You know, you've raised the problems of counting, but should we count? Should we have more statistics, or should we just grab the nettle and get rid of it? And then perhaps you'd say something more about the implications of your research for policymakers, what you think they should hear rather than what they do hear.
Thanks, Nikki. Oh, there's so much to talk about. There really is, and it's just, you know, it's incredibly challenging. And I think as an early career academic, you know, think you can change the world. And I think it's frustrating because you can't change the world necessarily, but you can chip away at it maybe. You know, and I do think, and I'd say that because I know a lot of the people here are early career, you know, you're doing your early career studies. And I think it's really important that we do chip away, because I think you can make change happen. I think that things can be different. So even the fact that the research that we did around needs actually was picked up by the police when they were developing their hate crime guidance, which meant that because we picked up that lots of gypsies and travellers were experiencing hate when we were looking at their needs, and then that meant that gypsies and travellers were included within the hate crime guidance for policing. So you can make a difference, you know, and you're not necessarily aware of where that difference is going to come from. So it's always really good, I think, methodologically, to be open-minded about where your research may go. And you know, so even though I do engage with quantitative work when I need to, because unfortunately Home Office, etc., multiple spaces, you know, from local authority to central government, they always want statistics. So I'm prepared to give them statistics if I need to, but I do think I've got a qualitative heart, and I think ultimately it's the qualitative data that really tells the story. I mean, that's me going off on something of an aside there. So I think in terms of counting, it's really, really difficult. Gypsies and travellers in the UK are so overcounted, it is untrue. Every 6 months, there's a caravan count. So every 6 months, how many caravans, vehicles, living vehicles, in every single local authority area are counted, which is really, you know, negative. And the caravan count is used as a tool to challenge gypsies and travellers around their own inclusion. And also it implies that gypsies and travellers only live in vehicles rather than also living, obviously, in housing, etc. So there are lots of connotations around counting that are problematic for gypsies and travellers specifically in the UK. However, I'm a bit like yourself. I am a bit old school, as in, if we don't know where problems lie, how can we address them? So I think responsible counting, so doing research which highlights the fact that people are being excluded on the basis of their race or ethnicity, I think that is important, because I think we need to be able to challenge very clearly with very clear evidence. So I think it's good to count to some degree, but I think with gypsies travellers, it's particularly difficult because of the way that counting has happened in the past and continues to happen. So yeah, I agree with you, it's not straightforward, but your statistics are a perfect example of how lacking in straightforwardness it is. So we do not know how many people have gypsy and traveller heritage in the UK. The 0.1% of the general population is really, 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 really low stat. Probably based on the census, because the census did allow space for people of gypsy and traveller heritage to tick a box in the last but one census. But the numbers of gypsies and travellers, if you look at needs assessments that were done across the country in 2006, we're talking about more like 1 to 2% of the population are likely to be gypsy and traveller. So there are a lot more people who come from those communities than is ever sort of formally recognised. And that's, you know, obviously people didn't want to present themselves on the census, but also they wouldn't necessarily have filled the census in because they wouldn't have felt confident to, because it's another part of the state bureaucracy which is challenging gypsies and travellers all the time. In terms of the number of prisoners who are gypsies and travellers, again, that's probably an underestimate, because people aren't going to put themselves forward as coming from those backgrounds because they know they're going to experience more discrimination. So that's hugely problematic as well. And the research that I'm doing at the moment with colleagues, Coretta Phillips at the LSE and Becky Taylor at the University of East Anglia, we're doing a study of gypsies and travellers' experiences of crime and justice since the 1960s. And it's an interdisciplinary study which looks back at the history of since the 1960s of policy and practice for gypsies and travellers, and it is gypsies and travellers, it doesn't include Roma. And we're also doing a crime survey to see how much, so sort of using questions from the British Crime Survey, or Crime Survey for England and Wales, but also using other survey mechanisms to measure discrimination, etc., so that we can understand how much gypsies and travellers are crimed against, because we have no idea really on a national level. And we're also looking at how much gypsies and travellers offend, because we need the biggest stereotype around gypsies and travellers is that gypsies and travellers are offenders. They've been criminalised by a system that has criminalised trespass, so that those people who are mobile can't stop and stay anywhere, and there's a lack of accommodation that's appropriate for those people. And currently going through the government process is the police, I can never remember the entire title of it, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, which further criminalises trespass, which is horrendous. So gypsies and travellers are criminalised if they're mobile, so that messes with the statistics. So we're doing this piece of research which is looking at trying to understand how we got where we are, trying to understand how crime and justice has been experienced by gypsies and travellers, but also talking to gypsies and travellers who are prisoners or on probation around their life histories, and doing life history research to try and understand more qualitatively the experiences of crime and justice for gypsies and travellers. Because we don't know anything about it, there is just a dearth of research. There is a young woman doing a PhD in this area, which is fantastic, and I think she's doing it in New Bucks, but it's really lacking. So we have so little information. So I think for me, the implications of the research that I'm doing, and I'm doing in partnership with my colleagues and with Gypsies, Travellers and Roma, and we're doing that project, we're doing it nationally, and we're doing it with multiple Gypsy and Traveller organisations support. I think the implications hopefully will feed into penal policy, will feed into sentencing parameters. There is a small project happening around sentencing of gypsies and travellers, I think in Leeds, but I can't quite remember. It's happening at the moment. But these things tend to be quite piecemeal. So what we're trying to do is pull it all together so that we can tell a story, so that we can actually set out what needs to happen for gypsies and travellers around their specific and complex needs. And I do find that interesting, that idea of individualizing sentencing, obviously, but around racial and social adversity mitigation. I really, really like that, because one of the big critiques of hate legislation is that it's all around enhanced punishment for offenders, when we spend most of our time arguing against the punitive environment that we've created through our criminal justice system. And I think looking at how we look at the other end of the spectrum more, But also, I like the idea of having racial and social adversity mitigation, because it's not, race is so important that we need to highlight the issues of race, but we also need to highlight the issues of other excluded communities who don't fit within equalities legislation in terms of race. So, you know, by just focusing on race, I think that negates the experiences of many people. So I don't know if that answers some of your questions, Nikki. Oh, somebody's put trespass is not criminalised at present, but will be by the police bill. That's true. That is true to some degree, but I would say that the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994 effectively criminalised trespass by making it so that it's so easy to arrest somebody for not leaving a piece of land and for taking their home, etc. So
it's called aggravated trespass in the 1994 Act, but it definitely is a criminalised form of trespass.
Absolutely. And so what's happening now is making, actually just really trimming down to the point where it's ridiculous. So when the CJPOA came in first, it was, I can't remember how many vehicles you had to have on the land for it to constitute you know, for the police to be able to come and evict, but it got reduced by the Antisocial Behaviour Act, and then now it's being reduced to one vehicle. You know, it's absolutely horrendous what they're doing.
Janny, I suspect that you're a bit of an expert. Would you like to come in and say something? The answer is that she may not.
No.
Yes. Hello.
Hello.
Hi. I at the moment am very involved. I've been working with the traveller community since the Dale Farm eviction, and currently engaged along with other comrades, you know, with attempting to get Cambridge City Council to actually put their money where their mouth is and provide transit sites for the travelers who move through Cambridge, because they have during the last year and a half, during COVID, Cambridge City Council was the only council in all of Cambridgeshire to evict every single group of travelers that came through Cambridge. It also coincidentally is the only Labour council in all of Cambridge, which was particularly despicable. But you know, they make noises about, in particular, the police bill, but they then carry on. But because what I was pointing out about that wasn't criminalized is that through civil intervention by the giving Section 77 orders, which tell people they have to leave within 24 hours, it's only if they don't leave that they can get threatened with the Section 78 order, which, you know, if they don't leave, then they can be arrested. Of course, they do leave because they don't want to be arrested, but it's an incredibly iniquitous situation. So, I mean, I just wanted to offer that up because, you know, you don't even need the law, the legislation to say it's criminal, because you have so many other, you know, ways to actually accomplish the same.
Well, Section 61, the police can move people off immediately.
Yes. So
there is case law around the need for welfare considerations, but you know that, and you know, and they're rarely invoked.
They don't. Yeah, they say in Cambridge. I mean, I think it's important because this takes place in Cambridge, but you know, in Cambridge, at a council meeting when we challenged this, the response of the executive council was to say, we adopt a welfare-based approach. But how can that be the result of a welfare-based approach and be in every case that people are evicted? And some of these traveling groups included, like one particular group was 18 children, you know, and it's absolutely outrageous during COVID as well, you know.
But it's not surprising that the police oppose the bill, is it? The last thing the police want to be is dealing with these social welfare problems as criminal problems. They've got plenty of other things to be doing.
Exactly.
Absolutely, and that's always been the case. You know, when I did my PhD on the application of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act by the police, and the police at the time didn't relish the idea of doing it. You know, they certainly saw it as a pragmatic tool, as the police do. You know, that moves a problem off my patch. But actually, you know, it's there's loads of evidence to show that the police, especially in senior spaces where they're more likely to appreciate the social issues involved, they are really frustrated by the fact that the way the legislation is, and the fact that local authorities are not providing. And the real tragedy of it is that in 2006, when the Housing Act 2004-5 required all local authorities to specifically measure the accommodation needs of gypsies and travellers in their local areas, alongside, but bespoke to gypsies and travellers alongside wider housing needs assessments. And Margaret Greenfield and I can't remember the name of the guy did the best study that was used as best practice in Cambridgeshire of how to do a good accommodation needs assessment that would very clearly set out the accommodation and social needs of gypsies and travellers in that area. And that was in 2006 that they did that. And yet, the same as in Devon, where I did mine, and in Cornwall, where I've done another one. I mean, actually, Cornwall has provided a transit site, so that's very exciting. As a consequence of that report in 2014, we actually did that one. But, you know, the councils they've, ever since the commons were closed for gypsies and travellers to stop and stay on, councils have had a legal duty to provide spaces for gypsies and travellers to stop and stay on. And they have never fulfilled their requirement. But of course, it's the gypsies and travellers that become, are stereotyped and problematised rather than the council for not doing what they should have been doing. It's just incredibly frustrating.
Until another question or comment appears on the chat, can I ask you something about gypsies and travellers as victims of hate crimes? Has anyone collected data on that? Because when we hear about hate crimes, it's nearly always people of other characteristics that we hear about, and we don't hear about the victimization, I think, in the same way. We hear plenty of prejudice. The press loves to give us very depressing stories. The killing of PC Harper last year by 3 boys from a traveller community. You know, the press really did outrageous coverage of many parts of that, I felt. But what would you want to say a little bit more about the victimization of travellers?
There has been a study done by, there's an organisation called Gate Hearts, which is Gypsy and Traveller Exchange in Hertfordshire. And they have a dedicated Gypsy, Traveller and Roma reporting mechanism for hate. They take in hate reports to support Gypsies and Travellers and Roma, but also to inform practice, good practice, etc. And they did a study, again with Margaret Greenfield, actually, who did the Cambridgeshire piece of work, which looked at hate and showed really high levels of hate against Gypsies, Travellers and Roma. But it wasn't a national study, it wasn't representative. I mean, you know, it's horrendous reading. But unfortunately, you know, how much cachet it has in terms of whether it'll be picked up sufficiently, because it isn't, you know, as comprehensive set of data as often policymakers demand, is another issue. I think it has been picked up, which is great. I've also done research, but I've done it down here in the southwest. And I found ridiculously high levels of hate crimes and incidents committed against Gypsies, Travellers.
But being prosecuted and being sentenced, being convicted, and it would be interesting to see how they were treated through the criminal justice process.
Absolutely. So that's what our project should be able to tell us in the long run. We should be able to get a far bigger picture and a national picture of people's experiences of hate, because that's incorporated into the survey elements of the research that we're doing nationally. But yeah, you know, Margaret's study with Gate Heart and my work has just shown that people are not willing to report. They don't feel that their cases, it's all the same reasons that other people don't report crime, you know, because they don't feel it's serious enough. It's so much of an everyday occurrence that they don't take it on board, you know, or they take it on board, but they don't think of going to any agencies. They see the control agencies as problematic in and of themselves, etc. So it just carries on in this cycle, really tragically. So yeah, there's a lack of information, but we're trying to gather as much as we can.
Aphrodita has her hand raised on the function. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment.
Hello. Thank you so much for organizing and for your presentation. I was really interested to hear and learn a little bit more about the semiological approach that you take and kind of the take on different layers of violence. So just before I kind of make my question, I just wanted to give a bit of background. Currently, my background is specializing in inclusive education and the role of creative arts interventions for young people's self-development and kind of non-medical notions of well-being. But my PhD was on an arts program in Macedonian prison, which is southeastern Europe. So some of the participants, it was in a male offender institution. Some of the participants came from Macedonian background, but also Albanian and Roma. And just generally, I guess, I have a vested interest in how social adversity and social harm and different forms of violence deny opportunities for young people to transform adversity and thrive. So I'm interested, my question is, what is distinctive about semiology in terms of other approaches to maybe social harm reduction, like sociological or criminological ones, especially because I kind of see some overlaps, and I'm not familiar with this kind of field, but I do see overlaps in terms of what came out from my PhD in terms of different forms of justice, like social justice, restorative justice, transformative justice. And I think it's interesting how the field of peace studies and peacemaking, and for example, Galtung's conception of violence in education, where we can maybe draw parallels of how maybe semiology intersects with peace making and the school to prison pipeline for disadvantaged communities.
Okay, so so semiology, I can't even say the word myself, is a big word and a broad area. So essentially, semiology is taking a harm-based approach, so social harm, appreciating that harm happens through multiple mechanisms. And you can align yourself to multiple different ways of understanding that. And I can, you know, if you want to email me, I'm more than happy to send you in the direction of some literature, which is no problem at all. So you can just Google me and send me an email. That's no problem. So there are different approaches you can take. I take an ultra-realist approach, which is quite controversial in criminology, because ultra-realism has been associated very much with understanding white working class culture. And so to apply it within the context of race and exclusion of minority communities seems, people don't necessarily understand that, but hopefully I've explained it in my work. So last year I published a book called The Harms of Hate Against Gypsies and Travellers, which utilises that approach, which literally unpacks the harms of hate across these three areas using Zizek's notion of violence. So I can't explain the whole of it in a really short period of time. I'm not quite sure how to do that for you. For me, what it does is it allows us to see the world from the perspective, in the case of hate, of the victim, to see and appreciate how hate manifests in their lives on that continuum of across discrimination, through discrimination, wider prejudices that are embedded in all aspects of our society. But it also allows me to see how neoliberal capitalism has augmented that environment. So through a consumerist, individualist, competitive environment, we are more at loggerheads than ever. And we scapegoat individuals more than ever because we don't see where the real problem lies, which is in the generation of extortionate wealth in small spaces. So yeah, I'd be more than happy to kind of give you some, you know, some references around that space of thinking and reading. But for me, that's why I utilised that mechanism. It was when I came across that way of understanding, it allowed me to raise the voices of Gypsies, Travellers and Roma more. I'm thinking about whether I've answered your question at all. Yeah, I think I kind of, yeah. Is that helpful?
Yes, that is very helpful. And thank you for being generous with offering. I may contact you, but I think it'd be quite fascinating to see what the implications of that, like of semiology, are for maybe for education and different forms of violence there.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So I've got a PhD student that's currently looking at the workplace and violence in the workplace. Because he comes from, and specifically the violence that trans people experience as a consequence of the workplace. And it's really, really interesting because it allows him, having that harm-oriented lens, he's not actually using ultra-realism, he's using a different framework, but it allows him to really unpack the complexity of work in our social lives and in our lived experience, not only going into work and leaving work again, but how work imbues all aspects of our lives and our expectations and our, how we consider what is valuable in our lives and who is valuable in our lives. And I guess that's what I would say as well. What I particularly like about the perspective that I use is it allows me to think about individual psychology. And that goes a little bit back to what you were asking about, Nikki, around hate and what we know about hate. I've actually got 2 PhD students at the moment, one that's part of a European network of scholars who are all doing their PhDs around issues of hate, and he's studying the comparative experiences of anti-Gypsyism across 3 European countries. So Roma people's experiences of hate, to really get that deep victim perspective. And he's doing it across Spain, Romania and the UK. So that's going to be really interesting to see what that tells us and where the commonalities lie and where the differences lie. And I've also got a PhD student who is doing a study of hate perpetration against Gypsies and travellers, as specifically to try and engage with the other side of that discussion of what's going on with those people. That's quite interesting. Well, that's not only just started, so I'm very interested to see how perpetrators of hate. So one of the things that we know about hate crimes is that people who are racists, for example, aren't necessarily the people who have had a sentence enhancement through the criminal justice process. So trying to understand that sort of perpetrator side around hatefulness, I think it's really important as well, talking to perpetrators as well as victims. Obviously, victims' voices for me are paramount, but I just think that's kind of another side to it that might be quite valuable. I'm just going to put my email in the chat so that you've got that there, if that's helpful to anyone. There you go.
We've got another nice question there. I was about to ask you a question about police as gatekeepers, but somebody's got a better question. So,
Okay, so could you talk a bit about your experience working with and researching these communities, particularly when you started first working in these contexts? What advice would you have for those who are planning on doing community-based research, not necessarily with these groups? Okay, so why did I come to this in the first place? The reason I came to it was because I worked at the Home Office as a researcher. I did an undergraduate sociology degree that was applied sociology, which was very methods oriented. And as part of that, I worked for a year at the Home Office doing research on criminal justice. And then I carried on once I'd graduated, working at the Home Office doing research. And that was in 1994 when the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act came out. And my colleagues and I were very interested in finding out about the public order aspects of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act. And at the time, I had a relation who was living as a new traveller. And it dawned on me as I was at work looking at this legislation that actually this was going to impact my relative. And I was really interested in that and how I could support him. And it led me, so we did a study of the public order provisions of the Criminal Justice Public Order Act as within the Home Office, and we interviewed the police and we looked at all aspects. So we looked at everything through aggravated trespass, around protests, but also criminal justice, but also around gypsies and travellers, also around raves, because the legislation was also incorporated the banning of raves, and fox hunting as well. The aggravated trespass was actually designed to tackle people who are trying to prevent fox hunting happening, which is just now all reversed because now fox hunting is banned. So anyway, so I started off literally looking at it sort of through these 2 different lenses. I could see this was happening, and I was went to the University of Surrey and said I'd quite like to do a PhD, and they said, oh great. And so I said, well, I might do it on the policing of protest, because I'd found that really interesting and found that particular part of the research really interesting. But then I found myself increasingly drawn towards the trespass around new travellers because of the family member. And I think that is kind of what happens sometimes, is there's a hook, there's something there just sort of pulling you in a direction. And so I talked to my relative and was introduced to other people, etc., through him. So I had a gatekeeper, I had an in, but I never saw it in that way. You know, probably when I wrote my methodology up, I wrote it in that way. But actually, in real terms, it was about me meeting people who I was worrying about. And that led me then onto obviously the literature and realizing that there was this huge community of people who were being treated really badly. So I kind of wanted to understand why they were being treated badly and the racism that underpins that, you know, because new travellers weren't experiencing racism. They were experiencing a different type of issue and discrimination. So, and the overlap between those two communities was really tense and problematic, but the legislation impacted them all. I mean, actually, we're sort of into the third, fourth generation of new travellers now. But yeah, so I came to it sort of very gently, probably, and gatekeepers, I think, are really important. But I'm still negotiating those spaces. And I think that the most important thing is just to communicate and be honest about who you are. Don't, you know, trying to go and talk to people that are not part of your community. The worst thing you can do is try and fit in if you don't fit in. You know, it's just horrendous, really. And I would recommend using qualitative method where you can, because then you can communicate effectively. But being very honest and open about who you're talking to, going through support organisations so that there's an element of protection for the people that you want to talk to, you know, so that they have that boundary between you and them, which is that support organisation. But at the same time, making sure that you don't rely too heavily or expect too much of support organisations. Because I think, what was the word that Alison Whitaker referred to researchers outside of communities being knowledge extractors. It's like we fly in and take the knowledge out of other people's, you know, experience. And you have to be really careful about secondary victimization, you know, or you know, the fact that people are being victimized by the fact that they're having to tell you about their victimization again. So I think that it's really important that you're cautious, that you only talk to people when you really need to, and that you do so through multiple gateways and mechanisms, that you always make sure that you are supportive of those people in any way that you can be, and that you're very careful when you leave the field as well as when you come into the field. That, you know, is often underestimated, that need to gently leave a research space. And some people stay in a research space and get in the way. So it's important to you know, leave people be as much as, you know, to lift them up. So I hope that sort of answers some of, you know, those questions. I think it's really difficult to get it right, and so it's about being a reflective methodologist and being careful about how you think about what you're doing. Yeah.
I think in the interest of time, so we might just have time for Nikki's last question about police as gatekeepers.
Thank you. Well, my question about police as gatekeepers was about the fact that the police see people from traveller communities both as victims and criminals. And how do you think the law or society could shift slightly to make their job easier? You talk about understanding social spaces. Mm. I think from the police point of view, it must be extraordinarily difficult to police social spaces in which travellers are clearly at home, if that's not the wrong word. Do you think that there's that they should approach it in a very different way so that they are not reinforcing the very obvious harms that you've been telling us about? I'm just troubled by, we always talk about the police as the gatekeepers to the criminal justice system. Police don't tend to happen upon crimes. They're responding to people who've rung up and said, those nasty people over there have been stealing or whatever. Do you have ideas on how policing might be different?
I think yes, absolutely. I think we need to train police properly around social issues and around, but training in policing, the culture of policing sees training very much in a kind of tick box sense and of what you're supposed to say rather than what you actually think. And I think we really need to tackle that. For me, is really important. We need to tackle that that perception of policing as this is what I'm supposed to do, so I think we need to talk to them about how they think about things rather than just going, you need to do training on gypsies and travellers and stop being mean to them. That doesn't work. It's about actually getting police to understand that communities are different and people have different priorities, etc., etc. And I think, there is a lot of good practice. We also need to highlight good practice where it is, because, evidence that carefully. But we need to work in communities. And this is why I'm interested in perpetrators to some degree, because I think we need to be, prepared to voice our objection to prejudice against gypsies and travellers and Roma. And people are nervous of doing that. And the hierarchy of legitimacy in relation to gypsies and travellers is so problematic. So the myth of the Romany gypsy as the, even my mum says it to me sometimes, and I think, God, I've been talking to her about this for 25 years. And she'll say, yeah, but they're real gypsies. They're all right because they're real gypsies. It's like this whole myth around one group being legitimate and the other people not being legitimate. In real terms, the people who are most likely to have secure accommodation are Romany gypsies, partly because of that legitimacy. Irish travellers often have the lower level, very low levels of legitimacy, and so they tend to live more likely to live on the roadside and suffer poverty and have all of the consequent issues related to poverty, as in association with crime or being victimized more often, etc., etc. So if we just keep talking about the real gypsies and, having this hierarchy, it's massively problematic. And we need to always challenge all of the time anyone who uses racial slur against gypsies and travellers, anyone who speaks ill of people in their local community. We need to shout out about it, and we need to challenge it, and we need to challenge the stereotypes, all of the stereotypes. So I've done loads of things like on local media, going on the radio, on the breakfast show, to try and talk about the fact that when we did our research in Plymouth, we found that fly tipping on gypsy and traveller sites was a massive problem. So people associate gypsies and travellers with rubbish, and then they go and dump their rubbish outside their sites. So then there's rubbish outside a gypsy and traveller site, and then they're accused of leaving rubbish. My favourite challenge ever was my boyfriend, who's a legend, and he was on Facebook, and a thing came up, and I will come back to policing in a minute. A thing came up on his Facebook feed, watch out, there's travellers in the area of a local area, and all these people are going, oh no, don't leave your dog in the garden because they're going to steal your dog and they're going to leave rubbish and all of this. And the big thing that people always say about is rubbish. And my boyfriend beautifully just posted a photograph of the local beach after Bank Holiday Monday on a summer weekend, and all the rubbish on the beach that all those people living in that area had left. And it was just a beautiful sod off to all of that narrative of, you know, and people blame the press, and the press is massively problematic and we need to challenge that. But it's that talk and the fear of challenge. And so I think as communities, we need to challenge. And then that means not phoning up the police every time a gypsy or traveller comes into an area, you know, because the police have to respond, you know, and they generally just go down there, say hello, you know, how long are you going to be here for? A couple of nights. Okay, that's fine. You know, you're going to have to move off then, don't you? You know, they're very pragmatic, the police. But if everyone stopped ringing them up and worrying about things that aren't going to happen, there's no evidence to show that crime rates increase when gypsies and travellers are in local areas. None at all. There was a dreadful programme on TV last year that tried to imply that there was, and there is not. You know, so we all need to shout out and we all need to say no, you know. Don't just say that there's some nice ones and some horrible ones. Just say no, stop discriminating against people on the basis of their identity. And gypsies and travellers suffer from that to such a degree. And then that has a knock-on effect, and you don't get the calls to the police. You know, the police themselves need to learn how to understand what prejudice is rather than just understand who they're not supposed to be prejudiced towards. And obviously legislation needs to not criminalise gypsies and travellers. Is that?
Shout out about injustice. That's good enough for me.
Fight the fight. It makes a difference. You know, I do think it should make a difference. If the more we shout, the more, you know, change happens. Gypsies and travellers were recognised in that hate crime guidance for police. They are part of the discussion. You know, they are getting funding for initiatives, etc. So we just have to keep shouting.
Right, and I think what a great note to end on. And it's been a really enlightening sort of presentation from you, Professor James. Thank you so much. And you've highlighted so many of the broad sort of range of issues, but also the intricacies that are around them, the many layers around the subjective, systemic, and symbolic violence classifications, inter-se conflict facing Gypsy, traveller, and Roma communities, and there's so much more. And thank you so much for talking about your rich body of work. Our thanks also to Professor Padfield for the very stimulating and critical commentary on Professor James's presentation and for tying it into the broader debates about criminal justice and policy. So I think we've all given us a lot to think about in terms of how the law operates and how it affects Gypsy, traveller, and Roma communities in particular. And again, thank you once again for sharing your time with us. And we're also very grateful for everyone in the audience who attended and who contributed to this event. With this, I would like to close. Before that, I'll just say that we do have a few other events coming up. The next event that the ISDG would be hosting is on the 24th of November. And in that, we'll be speaking to the director of the film Birth 1871, Mr. Dakshin Bajrange. So this movie deals with India's Criminal Tribes Act of 1871. And we'll be in conversation with Dakshin soon after the screening of the movie, which we're hoping to have in person, but depending on what the COVID situation is like, we might then otherwise circulate a link to the movie. To learn more about our upcoming events and to register for them, please visit our CRASSH webpage or the ISDG webpage, and the links to those will be posted in the chat. To get involved or give us feedback or suggestions for future events, do write to us at the email IDs that are also going to be posted there. But thank you once again for attending, and good evening or good day, wherever you might be in the world. Thank you so much.
Can I just say thank you for the opportunity? It's been a real pleasure to do this and just chatting you, organising this, and your patience around that. And it's been a real privilege to talk to Nikki, and who is so fantastic in her field. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And thanks for coming along, everyone.
Thank you so much. It's been a privilege.
Thanks,
Thank you so much.